So Islam grows and grows like the blob and conquers all these countries in the Middle East. And like I said before, within 100 years, they conquered Babylonia, they conquered Israel, they conquered Syria, they conquered Lebanon, they conquered Egypt. It's very interesting that 622 marks the beginning, 622 AD marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. And by 711, you have the invasion of Spain, Portugal, and France. And Americans really don't know history very well. The Muslim armies that came across from Gibraltar made it to a place in France called Poitiers. And Poitiers was the turning point of the Islamic invasions. In other words, the Muslims had victory after victory after victory. They conquered Spain, they conquered Portugal, and they conquered half of France. And very unfortunately, Americans don't understand the history. By the way, you know, American history is only 400 years old, since Plymouth Rock. And the Muslims were in Spain for 800 years. So the Muslims were in Spain for twice the time of all of America's history. You see, for Americans, there is no history before 1620. And if you think anyone in America knows what's going on across the border in Mexico or Canada, think again. America is a very, very mothballed country. It's like within its own cocoon, and it's very, very parochial. Americans don't know anything about what goes on outside of America, or Americans know very little about history, unless you're a history major in college. From 711 to 732 AD, the Muslims conquered Spain, Portugal, France. At the Battle of Poitiers, the king of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles Martel, and his great commander, Roland. I don't know if you remember the name Roland the Magnificent. And Roland got killed in battle, but he turned around the Islamic armies. He single-handedly, with his troops, he was a great hero. And of course, if you remember Charlton Heston and Sophia Loren, the El Cid, the movie El Cid. El Cid was the great Spanish conqueror who did basically the same thing later in Spain. So this is a protracted war, and it wasn't until 1492 that Christianity, or if you want to call it at that time Catholicism, actually defeated the Muslims and expelled the Muslims and the Jews from Spain. And that's probably one of the reasons today the Jews hate the Christians so much, is because the Jews were expelled or forced to convert to Christianity. So there's a lot of sentiment there against the Catholic Church, and that unfortunately projects towards the Protestants too. Though, like I said before, Protestants never persecuted the Jews like the Catholics did. 1492 was a very important year. Not only was it the end of 800 years of warfare with the Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula, but it was the year that Christopher Columbus sailed west. Now, Steven Spielberg in Hollywood probably make a movie about Christopher Columbus was a Northeast liberal Jew who wanted to prove to the world that the world was round, and that's why he sailed west. That's not the reason he sailed west. The reason he sailed west was because of the Muslims. See, this is never taught in American schools properly. 1492 came 39 years after what? 1453. Now, Americans don't know what 1453 is. 1453 was the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks. Now, the reason this is so important is because at that time, there were like 100, 200 years that you had the great Italian city-states. Genoa, Florence, Venice, Genoa. These places had their own armies, their own fleets. These were city-states. Each city had its own navy and its own army. And if you remember Marco Polo, there was known as a Silk Route to the east through Turkey, what is Turkey today. At that time, it was the Byzantine Empire. And then the routes went through what is today the 6 Islamic republics that broke away from the Soviet Union, and then into China and India, and through Afghanistan also. The whole renaissance of Christian Europe only could take place as a result of these trade routes coming in from the east. All of a sudden, Europe opened up to all these new cultures and all these new civilizations. Well, 1453 was the end of this. The Italian city-states, their armies and their navies, basically all went bankrupt when the Turks conquered Constantinople, and they changed the name to Istanbul, which is what you know today as Istanbul. By the way, remember the blob? You remember the 7 churches in Anatolia? All those churches are gone. And all the Christians are gone in Turkey. By the way, the Turks killed 1,500,000 Armenians in 1914, 1915. Nobody talks about that. That was the the Holocaust, the genocide that was the precursor to the Holocaust of the Jews. And Adolf Hitler said, if nobody said anything about the killing of the Armenians in 1914, 1915 by the Turks, then nobody will say anything about the killing of 6 million Jews. That's what Hitler said. So then it was the Muslims killing the Christians, and then it was Hitler killing the Jews. But I'll get to that later. Hitler was not alone. But anyway, so 1453 was the end of the trade with the East, with India and China. The Christians in Europe were starving. The Christians in Europe had a big problem. And so Christopher Columbus, who actually was an Italian Jew, the Italians were not interested in his idea of sailing west. So he went to Spain and he went to Portugal. Portuguese also refused him. And Ferdinand and Isabella said, okay, we will put our money on you. We'll put all our bets on you. And Christopher Columbus sailed west thinking he was going to reach India and China, and he would be the salvation of Europe so that there would be a trade route to the east. Everybody knew the world was round in those days except for the Pope. Anyway, Christopher Columbus accomplished something much greater than a route to the east. What he discovered was 2 entirely new continents. Now, by the way, I want to issue a disclaimer. I mourn for the Native Americans. I mourn for them. I hurt for what the white man did to the Native Americans. The Spanish and the Portuguese were especially brutal. But the British, the French, and the Dutch were not much better, and basically the Native Americans were disinherited from the earth. But what Christopher Columbus achieved was 2 major things, and you've got to understand these 2 major things to understand where we are today with Islam. Firstly, in 1492, it is true that the Muslims were expelled from Spain, Portugal, and France, but the Turks at that time had conquered all of Eastern Europe. The Turks controlled Moscow, the Turks controlled Kiev, they controlled Ukraine, Russia, Poland, they controlled Hungary. Hungary was under Muslim occupation for 150 years. The Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Croats, all these people were under the control of Islam. The Greeks were under the control of Islam. And by the way, just an important word, getting back to the word plunder, the Janissaries. Americans don't know what the Janissaries are. The Turks would go talent hunting. They had talent scouts, and they went looking for handsome Christian children. And then what they would do is call your parents, and then they'd call the parents over. And then the Turks would murder the parents and take the children back to Istanbul. They would turn these children into soldiers, Muslim soldiers. They would raise them in the court in Istanbul as Muslims. In other words, the Muslims kill and inherit. So they killed the parents of these Greek and Bulgarian Christian kids, took them to Istanbul, raised them as soldiers, and then these men were Janissaries that could be used as a paratrooper type force and a secret force of the Sultan against any tribe, this or that, without incurring the wrath. You know, you have these tribal wars going on, and you have the vengeance. So there could be no vengeance against the Janissaries because they were not tribal. They were Christians who were forced to become Muslims. Anyway, that's just a little side note about the plundering of Islam. The Turks were at the gates of Vienna for 200 years. I mean, if you ask anyone of German background or Austrian background, they know their history. The Turks nearly conquered all of Europe. By the way, the Russians have been fighting the Muslims for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. The church came to, under Cyril and Methodius, the church came to Russia in 995 AD. You see, Americans can't understand that because American history is 400 years. But the Russians have been fighting the Muslims for 1,000 years. So you have the first rise and fall of Islam in Spain, Portugal, and France. Then you have the second rise and fall of the Turks, who were Muslims, in Eastern Europe. And the greatness of Christopher Columbus was now all of a sudden this little bottleneck called Christianity or Christendom could expand to North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand. And the second great importance of Christopher Columbus was all the wealth of these new territories, agricultural wealth, gold and silver that came back to Europe, to these 5 Christian countries, Portugal, Spain, France, England, and Holland. And these Christian countries could build armies and navies, and wage wars with Islam.